Stop scrolling. You think you know the story of America's founding. George Washington, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. But what if I told you that the entire magnificent experiment, the one built on liberty, democracy, and equality, was nearly strangled in its crib by a conspiracy hatched not by a foreign enemy, but by the very men we call the Founding Fathers? Welcome back to r/history, where we dive into the deepest, darkest, and most astonishing corners of the past. If you love discovering the untold secrets that shaped the world we live in, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support keeps these deep dives coming. Tonight, we are unwrapping a true historical cold case, the Newburgh Conspiracy of 1783. This wasn't a riot, it wasn't a political debate, it was a planned military coup d'etat, a moment when the American Republic came within a breath of becoming a military dictatorship. Get comfortable. This is the sleeping history of how America almost lost its soul before it even got its first breath. Part 1. The Winter of Discontent, 1782-1783. The Unpaid Protectors. By late 1782, the Battle of Yorktown had been won, Cornwallis had surrendered, and the Treaty of Paris was being painfully negotiated in Europe. The war was essentially over. But for the 10,000 men of the Continental Army huddled in their frigid makeshift camps near Newburgh, New York, the end of the war felt like the beginning of a massive, infuriating betrayal. These were the heroes who had suffered 8 long years, the cold, the hunger, the blood. And what was their reward? Nothing. The Continental Congress, operating under the flimsy Articles of Confederation, was paralyzed. It had no power to tax. It was utterly bankrupt. The officers, the colonels, majors, and captains who had led these troops had been promised half pay for life, the so-called Commutation Act, in exchange for their service. This promise was the glue that kept the officer corps from simply walking away years earlier. But now, Congress could barely pay for paper and ink, let alone pensions. Astonishing fact, an officer's pay was so unreliable that many survived only by using their personal credit to buy supplies for their own men, sinking themselves into ruinous debt for the sake of the cause. The camp at Newburgh was a powder keg. The officers, who were often the social and economic elite of their respective regions, watched as Congress delayed, debated, and offered vague excuses. Their families were starving back home, their farms were falling into ruin, and their credit was shot. They realized with chilling clarity that once the peace treaty was signed and the army disbanded, their only leverage, their military power, would vanish forever. The Whisper Campaign. The discontent needed only a few sharp minds to turn it into rebellion. Enter a triumvirate of powerful, frustrated figures. General Henry Knox, Washington's chief artillery officer, a loyal but financially ruined man who was instrumental in moving the cannons of Ticonderoga. He felt the betrayal most keenly. Alexander Hamilton, not yet the Treasury Secretary we know, but a former colonel on Washington's staff and now a representative in Congress. He saw the Army's rage as a political tool. Robert Morris, the financier, the wealthiest man in America and the superintendent of finance. Morris was a political operator who believed the threat of a military coup was the only thing that could force the weak Congress and the states to give the central government real taxing power. This was the terrifying dynamic. The officers wanted their money, the politicians, Morris and Hamilton, wanted a stronger central government. They decided the officers' grievances were the perfect lever to force fundamental change. Morris, working through his assistant, Governor Morris, a key future constitutional framer, began secretly sending alarming, inflammatory letters to the officers at Newburgh. The message was clear: you will never be paid unless you take drastic action. The secret meeting and the incendiary. The final piece of the plot fell into place with the arrival of Major John Armstrong, Jr., a young firebrand aide to Major General Horatio Gates, a known rival of Washington. On March 10, 1783, anonymous handbills written by Armstrong and later called the Newburgh Addresses were circulated throughout the officer camp. They were masterpieces of revolutionary rhetoric, designed to inflame and incite. The key line of the first address was a brutal ultimatum to Congress. If peace takes place and you continue in a state of humble and silent expectation, you will perish in poverty and contempt. Change the mode of address. The action must be immediate. The second address was even more shocking. It called for an immediate, secret meeting of the entire officer corps to decide their next move. The suggestion was either refuse to lay down arms until paid, or, if the war continued, march the army west and leave the impotent, ungrateful Congress to fend for itself. This was the moment of decision. The officers were now openly planning treason. George Washington, the commander-in-chief, was being actively excluded from the conversation, and his authority was being undermined by his own men. The American Revolution had devolved into a choice between a military coup and national collapse. In Part 2, we will reveal Washington's incredible, desperate, and deeply emotional countermove, a moment of profound theatrical genius that saved the Republic and secured his place in history forever.
Part 2, The General's Plea and the End of Tyranny. Welcome back to r/history. If you just stumbled upon us, we're deep in the incredible true story of the Newburgh Conspiracy, a forgotten military coup in 1783 that almost ended the American experiment before the ink was dry. In Part 1, we saw how bankrupt politicians and unpaid officers, frustrated by a weak Congress, secretly plotted to use the Continental Army as a weapon to force political change. Now we move to the climax, a moment of raw, human drama that arguably saved the United States more definitively than any battle. If you are enjoying this deep dive, please remember to like this video and share it with a history buff. It truly helps the channel grow. Washington's desperate gambit. General George Washington was not stupid. He quickly caught wind of the anonymous addresses and the planned secret meeting set for March 11th. He knew the conspirators were counting on his age, 51, and his reputation for measured restraint to keep him silent. They expected him to either retire or be swept aside by the younger, more aggressive officers led by General Gates. Washington's position was excruciating. If he crushed the meeting with force, he would confirm the officers' worst fears, possibly sparking a civil war among his own men. If he ignored it, the army would march, and the Republic would be instantly lost to military rule. He chose a masterstroke of political theater. He canceled the unauthorized meeting, but immediately called for his own official meeting on March 15th, giving him 4 days to prepare a final, desperate argument. He spent those days drafting a speech, not a battle order, but an emotional plea. He knew he couldn't simply command obedience. He had to appeal to their shared sacrifices and higher ideals. Key insight: Washington understood that the officers were not greedy, they were betrayed. Their core identity as virtuous citizen soldiers was at stake. The speech that shook the Republic, March 15, 1783. On the designated day, the officers assembled in the wooden hall at Newburgh. The mood was tense, silent, and openly hostile to Washington. Gates sat in the chair, radiating defiance. The officers were expecting a reprimand, perhaps a dry political lecture. Washington strode to the front and began to read his address, a powerful, carefully constructed argument against resorting to tyranny, reminding them that their revolution had been fought against this very principle. He appealed to their patriotism. If you have a just regard to your own honor, if you have any regard to the name of American, resist the man who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire with blood. The speech was eloquent, but it wasn't immediately working. The officers remained stern and unyielding. The general saw the conspiracy holding fast. Then he pivoted, shifting from the political to the personal. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a letter from a Virginia congressman, which discussed the difficulty of Congress paying their dues. He paused, fumbling with the paper. He then spoke a few lines that became legendary. He said almost casually, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown not only gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The spectacles and the tears. The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. In the moment, Washington was no longer the general, the distant military commander. He was an aging, vulnerable hero. He was one of them. The officers, many of whom had served with him since the beginning, had never seen him use spectacles. He had physically revealed the profound personal cost of the war on his own body for the first time. The harsh, defiant atmosphere shattered. Several officers began to openly weep. The visible sign of his sacrifice, the failing eyesight of the man who had led them through every frozen winter and bloody summer, instantly cut through the anger and resentment. The conspiracy collapsed. When Washington finished the speech and silently left the room, the officers immediately voted. They passed a unanimous resolution condemning the anonymous addresses and professing their unshaken confidence in their commander-in-chief and their country. The plot was over. The legacy of self-control. Washington's act of self-control was unprecedented in modern history.
Instead of seizing power when his entire army and much of the political elite was urging him to do so, he chose humility and principle. In Europe, King George III reportedly heard the news of Washington's peaceful resolution and exclaimed, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Within months, Congress finally managed to secure the funding for the promised pensions. The Continental Army was honorably disbanded, and Washington, true to his word, famously retired to Mount Vernon. He proved beyond any doubt that the American Revolution was not just about winning independence, but about establishing the supremacy of civilian rule over military might. This moment, the Newburgh Conspiracy, is the ultimate proof that the most critical battle for American liberty was won not on a field of war, but in a small wooden hall, with a pair of spectacles and a plea for reason. Thank you for diving deep with us into this essential yet forgotten chapter of American history. If you want more stories like this that change how you view the past, make sure you subscribe to r/history and let us know in the comments what forgotten moment we should explore next.